Hello there and welcome to Radio Free Bay Ridge, your hyper-local progressive podcast focusing exclusively on Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. My name's Dan, and I am so happy to be back. We have a brand new season coming up for you all, talks with progressives in the neighborhood, explorations and origins of various groups, discussions on civics, analyses, all the things you've come to know and love from us since, 2017. We're going to get more into all of that, but today we're going to give you a special live episode that happened early this summer at Barrow's Intense Ginger in Industry City, where we sat down with our good friend Henry Stewart, who just released his brand new book, The Streets of Brooklyn. You might remember Henry and his book, How Bay Ridge Became Bay Ridge, which we interviewed him about at the Owl's Head Wine Bar. We'll talk more about the return of the podcast and what that means and our plans for the future. But first, mix yourself a cool drink, sit down, relax, and let's talk about the streets of Brooklyn. Hello. Hey everyone. If you are here for a book launch about historic Brooklyn, you're in the right place. If you're just here for drinks, enjoy it anyway.
Get ready for a lecture about historic Brooklyn.
All right, so quick introductions. My name is Dan. I will be interviewing Henry, who is right over here, over his new book, right over there. Yeah, there are so many books. We'll get into those books in just a second, but The Streets of Brooklyn is on the far right. Grab it. Henry, are you doing autographs at the end of this?
Absolutely not.
No autographs.
Some autographs.
All right, so I guess we'll start. I'm Dan. I'm the host of Radio Free Bay Ridge, and I've interviewed Henry once before for that book over there, How Bay Ridge Became Bay Ridge. It's weird that I've done this twice.
And many more times, I'm sure.
So, Henry, we know each other pretty well, I think, having interviewed you before. You've published many books, done deep dive articles about the history of Brooklyn. Before we dig into the latest book, The Streets of Brooklyn, maybe you could give everyone a little bit of background about who you are, why we should care about what you have to say about Brooklyn.
Hey everybody, thank you for coming out tonight. So I'm a journalist by profession. I've been a journalist for about 15 years. And I started to get into the history of Brooklyn when I discovered that the Brooklyn Eagle archives had been digitized. So suddenly there was this searchable database of primary source materials that are a slog to go through, but can yield many books. So I started doing that for some websites, and then I started compiling the stuff that I had done into physical, tangible books. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's acceptable, right? So you have a couple here, like a True Crime Bay Ridge, more True Crime Bay Ridge, How Bay Ridge Became Bay Ridge. You jumped now, it's The Streets of Brooklyn. You're expanding out.
Yeah, I wanted to, I didn't want to pigeonhole myself in Bay Ridge, because, a lot of people don't know Bay Ridge or respect Bay Ridge, so I wanted to... Agreed. But I wanted to, prove my, cred in the larger borough-wide history scene.
Awesome. So let's get right into The Streets of Brooklyn. You handed me an advance copy. It says not for resale, which just increases its value. About a month and a half ago, and I think the first thing that I really noticed was I was looking for the by Henry Stewart on the front, and it says by E.R.G. Who's E.R.G. and why did you steal their work?
Right. So most of the books that you see over here are books that I wrote. The Streets of Brooklyn is a book that I edited. It's a collection of 28 newspaper columns from the 1880s by a columnist who only, who somewhat mysteriously signed his columns E.R.G. And so I typed them all out, which was time-consuming work. And then they are heavily annotated by me to explain all of the sort of, institutions and people and places that no longer really exist, so that you fully understand what it is that he's studying.
E.R.G. Was that common for columnists at the time? Like, wouldn't they just sign their names, or?
No, it was pretty common. The Brooklyn Eagle usually ran little items that were bylined. They ran stories from other newspapers around the country and around the world even. But at the time, their columnists mostly signed their columns with their initials. There were one or two who actually signed their names, and there were a few that went by pseudonyms. There was one of them was Saunterer, who wrote Walks About the City. Recluse, I think, was one of them, but most of them would sign with their initials.
So I do want to talk about E.R.G, and we're going to get a lot into who E.R.G is and just how weird this guy is. But one thing that really struck me is how different he is from every other walking narrative. You expect a normal walking tour, and it's like, here's a building, and then we go to the next block, and here's a building, and here's a park, and here's the history of the park. E.R.G is extremely different than that, to put it lightly. How did you first find this guy's work?
I first came across E.R.G in, I think it was 2017. I had been working on a blog post about the history of Shore Road, which became the Shore Road chapter and how Bay Ridge became Bay Ridge. And I was just trying to read anything and everything from the past to get a sense of how Shore Road was different back then and how and why it changed. And I came across an E.R.G column that he had written. He takes a long walk from his home in sort of southern Brooklyn and walks all the way down 3rd Avenue and then 2nd Avenue and then Shore Road. And I was really, really impressed by it because it was so full of detail, it was so vivid, and it was so well written that I ended up using almost the entire thing, probably like 2,000 words. There are several pages in How Bay Ridge Became Bay Ridge that belong to E.R.G. But, the E.R.G, it was a little mysterious, sort of distinctive, and I just sort of filed that away. Like E.R.G, great column, really talented guy. And then it was a couple of years later, my wife had bought me a copy of Gowanus by Joseph Alexiou because she correctly guessed that was something that I would want to read. And about halfway through, he quotes the Brooklyn Eagle, this description of the Gowanus Canal, and he was like, and it's by E.R.G. And I was like, I know who E.R.G is. He wrote that great column about Shore Road. And so then I was like, oh, this is actually like a person who wrote a bunch of columns. And I started digging into it and dug up the 28 columns that are reprinted here in the book, some of which involve physically going through every issue of the Brooklyn Eagle from that time period because the text might be smudged or torn and E.R.G doesn't always clearly read in the search function. So I had to go in and do it manually, but here we are.
Yeah, I imagine E.R.G probably came up with a lot of false positives as it's just 3 random letters.
Yeah.
So other than, how interestingly he writes, and again, we're going to get into this, why did he, out of all of the other columnists at this time period, why does he deserve like a book compilation?
Well, he certainly sets himself apart from his contemporary columnists. He is very smart. He is a beautiful writer. He really captures, the living details of Brooklyn at that time in a way that no one else was. Most of the columns from this time period, it's 1886 and 1887. Most of his fellow columnists at the time were pretty dull, and their work does not stand up today. But E.R.G's, I would say, certainly does. And, why it's a book is because, essentially I think it already was a book. He was writing these columns around like a central thesis. There's a through line. It didn't require a lot of creativity or invention from me to sort of shape it into a book. It already was a book. I just had to literally turn it into one.
So what kind of streets are in this book? Like, where did E.R.G walk in the 1880s? There we go. We got the reading. Go through the table of contents.
Yeah, let me go to the table of contents here. It's mostly, he starts kind of in Brooklyn Heights and downtown Brooklyn, which is where Brooklyn itself sort of begins. And then he sort of spreads out to the developing districts at the time, sort of what we would now call Carroll Gardens and Cobble Hill, Park Slope, what he calls the Hill District, which is kind of modern day Fort Greene, Clinton Hill. And then he kind of goes back to the city center there's Sand Street, there's Hicks Street, there's Fulton Street, there's Clinton Street, there's Myrtle Avenue, there's Washington Street, Smith Street, Fifth Avenue, Lafayette Avenue, Henry Street, et cetera, et cetera.
Et cetera, et cetera.
That's not all of them.
You start off the book not with E.R.G, but with Walt Whitman, who was writing, I guess, like 20 years earlier?
Yeah, I like 20 to 40.
He writes like, keep your woods, O nature, and the quiet places by the woods. Keep your fields of clover and timothy, and your cornfields and orchards. Keep the blossoming buckwheat fields from whence the 9-month bees hum. And then you go right to an E.R.G quote, which I think really illustrates like how this guy kind of writes, which is, not one pedestrian 1,000 has the eyes for the things around him. So I guess my question is, between Whitman, 1867, and E.R.G, where he's writing about 1886, what had changed in Brooklyn?
The big historical context here is that the Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, I think. It had been under construction for decades, but it finally opened and ushered in this era of a freer exchange of people and commerce between New York and Brooklyn, which at this point had still not unified to form the 5-borough New York City. They were distinct cities. And so these columns are written 3 to 4 years after the Brooklyn Bridge is finally opened, and it's a time of great transformation in Brooklyn. I mean, aside from the original settlements of colonizers in the 17th century, kind of the big changes in Brooklyn were centered around transportation. The first was in like the 1820s when Robert Fulton's steam ferries started going between New York and Brooklyn, making that trip easier than the old rafts or whatever they were using. And then, 60 years later when they open up the bridge. And so suddenly, I found this report written in 1887 that said the year before 4,000 new buildings had been built, and this year another 4,000 buildings have been built. So it was very quickly kind of spreading out, and that's why suddenly, Park Slope is a thing. So it's a time of like colossal transformation as opposed to Whitman's time, which was a kind of,
bucolic.
Oh yeah, a bit more. I mean, it was still a city, there were still streets and businesses and people, but not on the scale that it was when this was written. I think the difference in population is like 4-fold or something.
So each one of the chapters in this book is a column in its entirety, and E.R.G walks basically one end of a street to the other most of the time. Sometimes he's like, I can't be bothered with this part of the street, and he just gives you his judgment on the rest of it. But as someone who's basically annotated this, and those annotations, every time he mentions a building or a lot, Henry has researched what that building is, where it was, because E.R.G doesn't really, he's not doing a walking tour. He's not telling you, this specific corner is where this beautiful building is, because at the time, anyone could just walk down there and look at the buildings. So you did that research. What street do you think has changed the most from E.R.G's time?
I would say there are two pretty good candidates. One of them would be Sands Street, which is funny because Sand Street has this notorious reputation from the early 20th century as for alcohol and for sex, and it was a hotbed of gay sex, and that's before E.R.G's time. I did have to look that up, and it was, they had moved the gate to the Navy Yard. The gate to the Navy Yard used to be on York Street, and then sometime in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, they moved it to Sand Street. And so all of the liquor stores closed on York Street and moved to Sand Street, so that if you were a sailor at the Navy Yard, you could just walk out the gate and everything, all the vices that you wanted were right there in front of you. So I think that example is funny because Sand Street has this reputation that is now totally gone, because Sand Street today is either taken up by highway infrastructure or it's all public housing. So none of that period of Sand Street history remains, but also none of E.R.G's time on Sand Street exists either. It was once kind of like one of the most important streets in Brooklyn. It's where a lot of historic families in the 19th century had settled. By his time, it had already changed, but the sort of remnants of that past remained. So that's kind of his tour of Sand Street. I think the other one that has, almost all of them have really changed, right? There's a chapter where he walks down Flatbush Avenue, starting in Flatbush when Flatbush was still like a semi-rural village, and not the densely populated urban center of today. But I think another great example is Furman Street, which is the westernmost block in Brooklyn Heights that runs along the waterfront. Today, on one side, it's the different modules of Brooklyn Bridge Park, and on the other side, it's the cantilevered section of the BQE with the promenade on top. But in his time, it was a working waterfront, so the west side of the street was all storehouses, kind of offloading goods from ships that would dock in Brooklyn. And on the east side, it was sort of homes and businesses to cater to the working waterfront. And none of that exists anymore.
Did Furman at that time, did it still accommodate for the slope? Like, it's a big change in elevation. How did buildings at that time accommodate that?
Furman Street's a very funny street, especially historically, because the next street over is Columbia Heights, which is one of the toniest, fanciest blocks in Brooklyn Heights, and always was. And it's next door neighbors with this rough and tumble working man's street. But because of the differential in height, they were very separated, both spatially and then culturally and psychically. There's a really great novel from the early 20th century called The Harbor by Ernest Poole. And I think one of the very first scenes is this little girl who lives on Columbia Heights with her family, and she's playing in their garden. And all of a sudden, a hole opens up in the garden, and this man sticks his head out with a mustache and laughs, and she screams, and then he disappears. And it's because the gardens on Columbia Heights, at least the houses on the west side of the street, were literally on the roofs of the tenements on Furman Street.
Yeah, I know E.R.G. constantly harps about this one guy who has a telescope on his garden, but it's on top of a factory.
There actually, on Furman Street, there was an observatory. I could find that it existed, but I couldn't find any details about why was there an observatory, who owned this thing. No one seems to have cared at the time, so they didn't write it down. So I couldn't tell you, except it's on a map.
Did you actually walk any of E.R.G.'s routes doing your research? Started where he started and just had the book open?
I didn't do it with the book open in front of me, but I definitely walked all around the places that he was writing about. One very intentional trip I made was down Clinton Street because it's one of his favorite streets. And so I did the walk from one end of Clinton to the other. It starts in Brooklyn Heights and it ends in Red Hook. That's a street that physically kind of remains the same as it was. There have been modernizations of some of the brownstones and things on that block, but for the most part, you're seeing these 19th century homes the way, more or less, that they would have appeared to E.R.G. But what you don't really get is I think the experience of walking down the street is very different now than it was for him. And not just because of cars and yuppies, but because, especially Clinton Street was kind of it was for promenading. And so all of the prettiest girls in Brooklyn would stroll down Clinton Street. And he thought it was such an agreeable, pleasant, positive experience. And not that the people walking down Clinton Street today are ugly, but they're not. Some of them, I guess. But they're not out for strolls to be seen. It's people kind of hurrying from point A to point B. Even though the buildings are the same, the experience is very, very different.
It's funny that you mentioned the girls that he harps on that kind of a lot. He also has a whole section where he describes how homely Manhattan girls are.
Yeah.
But he starts off really simply. He starts off on his own street. Does it seem like he intended to make this what would become a book? Or do you think he just kind of called the newspaper up and was I have something to say about my street, and then all of a sudden it got popular?
He had started writing for the Eagle before the columns that appeared in this book. He had been writing a lot about parks, Prospect Park especially, and then he profiled a painter who lived on Sackett Street. He wrote about a vocational school in Greenpoint. He was just kind of writing about whatever. And then the column about the long walk that ends in Bay Ridge precedes his kind of project. But I don't know, maybe it was walking around Brooklyn and the surrounding towns. Maybe it inspired him to, take a closer look at his own street, which was Sackett Street, and write a profile of it, which is, a lot of it is just like kids playing, which is really fascinating. The games that little girls and little boys played, and the schemes to steal peaches from the tree that overhangs the sidewalk. But I imagine that column must have been popular, or at least well received. And the editor was like, hey, do another one of those. And he just kept going. There are 28 chapters in this book, which constitute all of his street profiles. There is a suggestion in one of them, I think it's the Court Street chapter, where he says that he thinks there was a rumor that he was going to Court Street soon, and all of the shopkeepers intentionally put fancy things in their windows to make them look better than they were. I think one of them is claims to have Ham's shoes, Noah's son Ham.
His shoes?
Right, discovered on Mount Ararat, and they're really just from a scarecrow in Bay Ridge that were stolen by someone who escaped from the inebriates asylum and then sold them for alcohol. But the idea that they would be trying to gussy up their storefronts because they knew this guy was going to come and write up Court Street eventually suggests that people were interested in these columns and reading them.
So one of the other things that I want to get into, in every other column, he absolutely goes off on this. I wonder if anyone can kind of guess, in the 1880s, what's the one thing in Brooklyn? This guy loves Brooklyn. What's the one thing in Brooklyn you think he hated? Trolleys are a good one. He does go off on horse droppings quite a bit. He complains a lot about, this is these horse droppings, it's like a dirt road again. Why pave it if you're just not going to pick it up? But nope. That one we're going to go into, absolutely. He was a product of his time. The Gowanus Canal. Every other chapter, he finds a way. He's out in Flatbush, and he's like, the Gowanus Canal ruined Flatbush. What do you think is the most outlandish thing he blames the Gowanus Canal for?
Yeah, he basically blames the Gowanus Canal for all criminality in Brooklyn. There's while he was writing, there was this man, I think he was an executive at a hat company, and he lived in Bed-Stuy, and he was murdered by a burglar who he caught in his house. And E.R.G. blames the Gowanus Canal for that, because all criminals in Brooklyn come from the Gowanus Canal and are just returned to right. They come out of the
They spawn from it.
They're facilitated by the canal. The Gowanus Canal at the time was a working waterfront. Every inch of the Gowanus Canal was lined with lumber yards and coal yards and oil yards and tobacco wholesalers and, people getting goods delivered by boat from the canal. But because these boats are coming from other places and you can't really, they're not being policed or watched, it's easy for, in his mind, smugglers to be on those boats and then hop off the boats, and now you've got smugglers in the streets of Brooklyn, going as far as Bed-Stuy to murder hat executives. The point of entry for all criminals for him is the Gowanus Canal. You're right, in almost every chapter, he stumbles on the Gowanus Canal. There is one, I think it's Bond Street. I don't really know the geography of Brooklyn. I think it's Bond Street that runs right next to the canal. And so he walks along and just criticizes every single business that he encounters along the way, because they keep their goods piled up in the street, and these are public streets and you can't block them, and they're being used for private purposes. And he just basically names one by one, and then there's this lumber yard and all their wood is in this street, and then there's this coal yard and all their coal is in this street.
He starts off just criticizing the industries, and as the columns go on, his Gowanus rage increases and becomes more outlandish until I think near the end he just suggests filling it in, that you fill in the Gowanus Canal and Brooklyn will return to like the best it can possibly be.
I mean, he was probably right.
I mean, we could have had no Gowanus Canal today if he had just gotten his way, because he has all these little moments. At first, he's just describing his streets, and then he starts like having pet projects.
Right.
Like in his columns where he starts like going like, politically, I think that we should like have wharfage fees on the Gowanus Canal, and then I think he demands that Brooklyn get its own customs house, and that Manhattan's custom house and all of the commerce on Manhattan is crap, and that Brooklyn's the ideal dock.
I think he was right in that Brooklyn was actually getting more goods. You know, it was a busier port than New York was, but New York had the customs house, which meant it got the money and the tariffs. And so there was all this power in New York, even though it was really Brooklyn where all of the trade was being done. So he wasn't wrong. I mean, that wasn't fair, you know. It's kind of, you know, Manhattan getting its, getting its way, even if it doesn't deserve it.
Other than the Gowanus Canal, are there any other things that like E.R.G. writes about when you were annotating that are like, whoa, that's a weird thing to like absolutely hate? The thing that comes to my mind is that he really doesn't like boys buying girls ice cream.
Well, he's outraged by the obligation of young men to buy ice cream for young women. There's a chapter where he brings this up a few times. He keeps kind of circling back to it. I mean, some of his ideas and outrages are funny. There's a chapter where he describes, I think it's the merchants of Smith Street who drive their wagons up to Clinton Hill and call on the housewives who live there and tell them about the best produce that he has or the best cuts of meat. And the woman will say like, great, sure, bring it by and I'll give you the money. And he can't stand this because women have an obligation to their husbands and their families to learn how to select the best produce on their own. They are abdicating their family responsibilities, a whole generation of weak women who don't even know how to select produce. It's silly. I mean, especially 140 years later, there are things to chuckle about. But then he has these insane etymological beliefs. I think there's one chapter where he says that everyone who eats fish basically speaks the same language. So this is the Native Americans on the East Coast. It's Iceland, Norway, Scotland. All of these people basically speak the same language. And so he'll investigate like native words and try to explain to you what they really mean by like, because we see this same thing in Iceland, and that's what it means in Iceland. So clearly that's what it means in Algonquin.
Was it Wallabout that he was like, I found a word in Icelandic that sounds similar, so I will justify it?
I think that there was a Native American settlement called, I can't pronounce it, but Marekiawig or something like that. And he breaks apart Marekiawig, all the different parts of the word, and he'll be like, because in Scotland, rek means this, and in Iceland, like, wig means this. So, puts it all together, and he's like, and that's how I know that this is what it means, very confidently, like, several pages later. And that's kind of the book at its worst. I would recommend that you just skip those parts.
Literally right in the footnote that starts that whole section, you can safely skip these 3 pages. But that etymological discourse like really shows also like how bizarre E.R.G. is in that like he often presents himself as like a polymath. There'll be a tree and then he'll be like, and I know the exact genus of this tree and why it is a superior tree and that Manhattan has shit trees and Brooklyn has these trees, which is why Brooklyn is superior, and then goes off like on a botanist's explanation. You're like, where did you study botany?
France. In the introduction, it's he possessed deep knowledge of architecture, trees, and the history of Brooklyn, and he was well educated and knowledgeable about the arts, quoting Shakespeare and the Mikado when the latter was just 2 years old. His knowledge of architecture is impressive. He's very detailed. When he finds a building that he likes, or dislikes, he really gets into it and describes it to you, and it would seem as though he had studied architecture. He knows a lot about trees. He knows a lot about insects and beetles that are dangerous to trees. He knows a lot about birds. He's a very educated, well-rounded man. There's a part about, I think it's locust trees that were in Brooklyn Heights. And he says Brooklyn Heights used to, like before it was Brooklyn Heights, it was covered in locust trees. And that in recent times, a commission in France has discovered that locust trees are the best for combating erosion. And that no one really knew this until the French discovered this in the 19th century. And he's like,
I spoke to the French guy who discovered it.
Right. But in the 18th century in Brooklyn, somebody was just walking around planting locust trees that prevented Brooklyn Heights from just like falling over, prevented the erosion and the collapse of Brooklyn Heights, because the people who lived in Brooklyn, even going all the way back to the early colonists, were the smartest, best people who even knew how to prevent erosion before the scientists knew it.
I wrote down in my copy of The Streets of Brooklyn, I have a running shit list of things that E.R.G. thought were inferior to Brooklyn. Not that he hated them, but there's just that Brooklyn does this or is better than these things. So first one is Bostonians, Chicago as an entire city, French botanists, the Gowanus Canal, New York City, i.e. Manhattan, Genoa. I think he says that the promenade in Brooklyn Heights does it better than Genoa.
Yeah, and I think it's also Park Slope, because he imagines, if Park Slope had been developed by the Italians, it would have been terraced. And you would have these long staircases going from Fifth Avenue to Prospect Park West that the poor grocers would have to, carry their sacks or bring donkeys up with them. And, in Brooklyn, they were smarter to just build, graded. Yeah, maybe. But yeah, and then it's also Furman Street that he imagines the Italians, a similar thing. It would have been terraced rather than retaining walls.
Keeps going. Thackeray, randomly, he thinks that is inferior to Brooklyn for some reason. Sparrows, as a whole, are birds that he dislikes. Politicians in general, especially Brooklyn politicians who he thinks don't deserve Brooklyn. Modern fireworks operators he really despises. The Statue of Liberty, which he never names he calls it, what does he call it?
Because he's French?
Yeah, I think it's because it's French, but he's been to France, right? So
Yeah, it's the Bartholdi Statue.
He calls it the Bartholdi Statue often, and he says that there are some places that have a good view of it, but Brooklyn has a bad view of it, so he doesn't like it.
It looks okay if you look at it from the Brooklyn Bridge, but pretty much anywhere else, it stinks. And this was a time when the development of Brooklyn was very low scale, so you could stand on Flatbush Avenue and see the Statue of Liberty. You could stand on Shore Road and see the Statue of Liberty. It was visible from everywhere, which is why he keeps coming back to it, because he keeps seeing the damn thing. There's a point where he says that they should have put the Statue of Liberty in Prospect Park, at the top of the tallest hill in Prospect Park, because then you would be looking up at the Statue of Liberty, and it would have nothing behind it but sky, and it would be majestic and triumphant, and now you're always looking down at the Statue of Liberty.
And Jersey.
Yeah, with Jersey in the background.
So, okay, the last couple of things. He hates cobblestones, which he says are way different than Belgian pavers, and bricks, just general brick construction as a whole, which he says that Americans are inferior.
They don't know what they're doing with brick. No clue.
And bankers.
Yeah, but nobody likes bankers.
So, despite his education, and he always name drops this stuff, he really likes blue-collar Brooklyn. What are some of the blue-collar scenes of the streets that he describes that really stuck in your head?
He travels all over Brooklyn. There's nothing that will stop him from going wherever he wants. So while he'll go to, Lafayette Avenue and look at all of the fancy villas, he'll also go to the end of Columbia Street where people are living in shanties, and report on the doings of the shanty people. There weren't a lot of Black people in Brooklyn at this time. That's really in the 20th century with the Great Migration. But there were, isolated communities. There was Weeksville, which he doesn't visit. But one of the most valuable parts of this book, I think, is there's a section where he visits a street called Cleveland Place that no longer exists, but was just west of 3rd Avenue, in the Gowanus neighborhood. and it was 2 neat rows of houses on either side of the street, and they were all lived in by like middle-class Black professionals and their families, journalists, clergymen. And the New York Public Library has a photograph of Cleveland Place, which is interesting. But he spends like 3 or 4 pages on Cleveland Place and like visiting and seeing how like their white ethnic neighbors harass them and interact with them. And it's the only record that anyone seems to have left behind of Cleveland Place. And it was E.R.G. because he was just wandering around and like, what's this? Cool. You know? He goes to Navy Street. Navy Street had a sort of disreputable reputation. A big part of it was new Italian immigrants. It was Black laborers. But the southern end of Navy Street for like 3 blocks had these respectable upper class white families on them. And he writes about like how it's kind of embarrassing for them. Like they'll be at a party and they'll be, well, where do you live? And they'll say Navy Street. And, you know, they'll be like, give them a funny look, you know, and no, I live on the part of Navy Street with this respectable family and this respectable family. But then it turns out like a few years later after this column was written, they renamed the southern part of Navy Street Rockwell Place, which still exists to this day. And the reason that it's called Rockwell Place is because the residents of that part of Navy Street felt embarrassed being associated with the rest of Navy Street. So I thought that was an interesting bit of history.
Doing all of your annotation, were there any moments where E.R.G. like talks a lot about something, but were there bits where you're just like, this guy's full of shit?
There were parts in the footnotes where I was kind of like fighting with him and being like, you jerk. That I had to sort of scale back a bit because I didn't want it to get too pale fire. It's the etymology is definitely the worst part. He is also just sometimes factually incorrect. Like there was a fort during the Revolutionary times called Fort Sterling, and he's like, it was built by the British, and I was, no, it wasn't. Like it was built by the Americans, and it was on this corner, and it's like, no, it wasn't. It was on this other corner.
Native Americans too, though, right?
Native Americans, he's just insane. I mean, he has like no knowledge of Native Americans, and yet very confidently pretends that he possesses all of the information. At one point, he's like, because, of course, as everyone recognizes today, the Algonquin and the Aztecs were like closely interrelated. And it's like, no one believes, no one thinks that's true today. And it's not like, here's what people are thinking, or like, here's an idea that's gaining some traction. It's like, and now we've proven once and for all, that the Aztecs and the Algonquins were identical and maintained a highway, across the continent to keep in touch. And, we all know that Iroquois means, followers of the true serpent. And it's like,
oh, the serpent.
And it's like, that was one theory in the 19th century that's not really widely credited then or now, but like, sure. Yeah, everyone agrees.
Other than the stuff that he's just wrong about, like, he was a product of his time. To be much more blunt, he was a racist. How did you handle that? Like, was there anything on the cutting room floor? Like, how did you handle, like, those moments where he goes kind of off the rails?
Textually, I didn't touch a lot. I changed some whiches to that. I added some commas. I cut some commas. But, yeah, he's definitely racist. I don't think that you can, I don't want to like couch this like, not really, but he's definitely racist. But when it comes to Black people, he is sort of aloof and condescending rather than like vitriolic. There's a chapter where he meets some Black school children and rubs their head and doesn't understand why they don't like that. But it's that sort of thing. He's very sympathetic to the Irish in their shanties. Like, there's this long defense of like, sure, like they're living in squalor, but like who among us doesn't hide dirt under our, rugs? And he's very sympathetic to them. But the one group that he does not like are the Italians. He thinks they're foul-smelling, they're animalistic, they're only half wrong. He's Italian, he can say that. He thinks that they're like a threat to the Republic because they cannot be civilized. Or, or is worried that they can't be. He's very skeptical of it, and he's very worried about the future of the United States because of the Italians.
Look where we're at.
Yeah, so look where we're at today. Do you think that if E.R.G, you've kind of resuscitated E.R.G with this book, but do you think if he actually rose up from the grave and saw Brooklyn today, do you think he would still have that Brooklyn pride thing? How do you think he'd interpret modern Brooklyn?
Well, I don't think that he would like the ways that Brooklyn has changed. I think he was a very human-scaled pedestrian. I don't think he would like cars. I don't think he would like tall buildings. I don't think he would like that you can no longer, walk several miles from the center of Brooklyn to the countryside. Because that was something, there's a whole chapter when he walks to Bay Ridge where he's like, the great thing about Brooklyn is you can just start walking and then you wind up in the country and it's beautiful. Unlike Manhattan where you have to cross a bridge to get somewhere nice.
Like Brooklyn.
Right.
Would he still be prideful of Brooklyn compared to everywhere else?
Yeah, probably. I mean, Brooklyn has failed us in all these ways, but it's still vastly superior to Manhattan, Boston, Chicago, the rest of the Midwest, certainly the West. France, Canada.
You've been working on this book for how long?
It was about 5 years, on and off.
So you've had E.R.G in your brain for about 5 years. And I'm going to ask now the question that's kind of like the elephant in the room, because it's so awkward saying E.R.G. Do you have any theories on who he was?
No. No, I'm kidding. I do. So I was trying to approach this in different ways. I was looking at people who were buried in Greenwood Cemetery, and there were no pay stubs from the Brooklyn Eagle from the 19th century. What I eventually settled on was city directories from the time. So there are phone books before phone books from the years that we're talking about. And so I looked at people with the last initial G and the first initial E. I couldn't find any journalists living on Sackett Street, which would have been a slam dunk. But I did find somebody named Edward Rowland Green, whose address is listed on Henry Street, which was his father's house. And so there is no other candidate that could be E.R.G. It would be weird if such an erudite man was not in the directory. And so really the only candidate would be Edward Rowland Green, even if there are slight differences that create doubt, like his address. And he was a member of the same church that E.R.G. seems to have belonged to. Edward Rowland Green was a bachelor, which E.R.G. says several times that he's a bachelor. So there are those kind of small, superficial coincidences that I think it would have to be him. But Edward Rowland Green was a lawyer. He always appeared in his business dealings as Edward R. Green, used all three of his initials the same way that E.R.G. did. So it would seem to me that Edward Rowland Green, before he started practicing law, dabbled in writing columns for the Brooklyn Eagle, and then set it aside and pursued his law career for the rest of his life, and then died a bachelor and was buried next to his parents in Greenwood Cemetery.
How old would he have been?
I think he was born in the 1860s, so when he was writing these columns, he would have been about 25. At first I thought that E.R.G. would have to be an older person because he writes so much about old Brooklyn and seems really familiar and immersed in that. But I think it was actually that he was just getting that information from his father and from his neighbors. Because one of the things is how much E.R.G. walks. I mean, to imagine a 65-year-old man walking 12 miles a day on unpaved country roads seems less likely than a young man doing the same thing, to me.
That's E.R.G. with a bushy mustache.
Edward Rowland Green.
Edward Rowland Green. I'm just going to call him Eddie now. So Eddie really seemed to like the old school Brooklynites, because if he was growing up as a lawyer, right, and his father was reasonably well off, he probably looked up to these guys, but he really paints them as the movers and shakers that made the streets of Brooklyn. When he's describing these streets, he almost describes it like games of chess that these wealthy titans are like, I'm putting my street down, and you were blocked by this other guy. Was that how streets in Brooklyn were laid out?
There have been colonial settlers in Brooklyn since the 17th century, but none of them really had much of an effect on Brooklyn as it is today until the early 19th century. And that's when New York is growing and expanding, and there's kind of a desire for people to get out of Manhattan and maybe move across the river. And so in the early 19th century, you have these developments starting to take place. And these are the men who now have streets named after them, like Hicks, Pierrepont, Joralemon, Remsen. You know, there are some streets in Brooklyn that are, you know, ancestral, that are like old native roadways, like probably Fulton Street, maybe Myrtle Avenue, this street that no longer exists that was called Red Hook Lane. And then in the 1830s, the city of Brooklyn decides to cut up the entire city of Brooklyn into a street grid. And that's when you get every single street from Brooklyn Heights to Brownsville, from Dumbo to Sunset Park. Every street is drawn out. But in between those two things, there was Hicks, Pierrepont. They were, farmers. They had big pieces of land, and they started to think maybe we could cut these up into lots and sell them to people who could build houses here. And those houses and those lots would be placed along streets that they devised. And that's why those streets are usually named after them. But yeah, his highest respect is for Pierrepont. Hezekiah?
Hezekiah?
Hezekiah Pierrepont, who was much smarter than Old Man Hicks and laid his streets out in a different way that capitalized on the breezes in the summer and the way the air moved in the winter. It was just a much smarter way to build streets and houses than Old Man Hicks.
He ascribes everyone who chose to live in Brooklyn as having like a genius level intellect versus Manhattan. And that's why he has so much respect for the old Brooklynites, is like, they saw the real place to settle, not Manhattan. Because he describes Manhattan as like a fen of like fetid bogs and like mosquitoes and like just swampland and like shit washing up on the river. And then he's like, but Brooklyn has hills. And our shit rolls downhill and into the river, as opposed to those Manhattanites who live in a swamp. It's like we invented hills.
Well, Old Man Hicks invented the hill.
I love his love of Brooklyn, but at times it gets to be a little much and gets in the way of the history. He loved Brooklyn so much that one of the through lines through his columns is he imagines constantly like quizzing politicians and civil servants. He's like, every politician should have to go through this quiz that I made up of Brooklyn street trivia.
I thought those were real.
Wasn't one of them like that everyone who wants to run for office in Brooklyn has to point on a map where number 2 Court Street is?
Number 1.
And it's because it doesn't exist, right? It's like all trick questions.
Yeah. He talks a lot about number 1 Court Street, which doesn't exist. You know, there's a number 2, but on the other side of the street, it's City Hall, what's now Borough Hall,
park.
And then there's like a park. And so by the time buildings start on that side of Court Street, it's already on the other side of the street up to like 44. And so the first building on Court Street is number 45 rather than number 1, which he thinks is this very clever thing. Make sure people know. I think another one is, what is the first street to cross Fulton Street? Which,
What do we got?
it's not, no, because J becomes Smith.
He's a jerk about it. You have to remember, E.R.G is being a jerk. It's the first street to cross.
And when we're talking about Fulton Street, we're talking about Old Fulton Street and Cadman Plaza West, which historically were Fulton Street. Middig Street crosses Fulton and becomes Sands. J crosses Fulton and becomes Smith. And that happens for like every single street all the way down until you get to Navy Street. Great trivia.
I think we should go into like a reading to really get a feeling for E.R.G, but I think we're going to take like a 5-10 minute break, let everyone get more drinks, get a little liquored up, and we'll do a little bit of Q&A and a reading, yeah?
Sounds good.
Grab some drinks, guys. We'll be back in a little bit.
Hi, everybody. We're going to start again.
Well, I'm just going to start talking and hope you all follow my lead. I wanted to read from a chapter of this book tonight. I thought, since we are on 3rd Avenue, that I would read the chapter in which he walks down 3rd Avenue, past just about where we all are right now. The headline of this column was Pedestrian Pleasures, which became the subtitle of the book, which is The Streets of Brooklyn, The Pedestrian Pleasures of a Sunday Columnist. A man after my own heart. I'm going to skip most of the footnotes, but I'll throw them in when they need to be there. The heats of summer have at length passed away, and with the cooler air of the fall, the hardy and the robust begin to enjoy the pleasures of pedestrianism. He is truly fortunate upon whom a kindly nature has bestowed the gift of a stout pair of legs, for he sees the aspects of landscape scenery as no one else can. There are certain railroads that advertise themselves as specially desirable because they traverse a line of country that is singularly picturesque. But to those who have known the delights of ascending the zigzag paths of mountains or of traversing the lonely and shadowed roads that lead through great forests on foot, the hasty and unsatisfactory glimpses of the beautiful, seen from the windows of a parlor car, only irritate and vex and render feverish with longing to be on foot and wandering among them. It is undeniable that the young men of the present generation are much more athletic than their fathers, are less wedded to money-making and material pleasures, fonder of yachting and of baseball, and above all, are much better pedestrians. And now is the time when the wise ones who have hoarded up their vacation time until they could walk with pleasure throughout the day take their packs upon their shoulders and wander through the Catskills, or the White Mountains, or the Berkshire Hills, or the Blue Mountains. With light heart and nimble steps, they breast the outland and climb the crag and break through the undergrowth of the ravines. The air is cool and pure, the breeze a pleasure, and movement a delight. To those who squandered their holidays at Long Branch and Coney Island and Newport, who lounged upon the plaza and loitered upon the beach, there is no possibility of lengthened pedestrian tours now. But those who have the good fortune to live in Brooklyn have at least the privilege of short pedestrian trips of the most enjoyable character. The New Yorker is cribbed, cabined, and confined in a long, narrow island shaped like an olive oil bottle, from which he must emerge before he can wander along the Sound or skirt the waters of the noble Hudson. For him, therefore, pedestrianism must commence with the elevated railroad. But the Brooklynite, happy being, can start off on a short walking excursion from the door of his domicile. He has before him many trips which may be made on foot, and among the pleasantest is a walk to Fort Hamilton. He need not strike 3rd Avenue until he is in the neighborhood of Greenwood Cemetery, from which point it is an agreeable path open toward the bay at many spots and lined with fine trees and quaint old villas in the midst of old gardens. Some of these have the air of being anti-revolutionary and present the excellent woodwork and graceful decoration usually associated with good colonial residences in the days when George III was king. Both Manhattan Island and Long Island received many colonists of sturdy yeoman families of England, mingled with whom were the younger sons of the gentry. Both of these classes had a high opinion of their social standing and thought it incumbent to have good houses, so that many of these relics along 3rd Avenue and in Flatbush are ornamented with carved woodwork done by hand in excellent style. It is of unpretentious character, but the workmanship is often so superior as to induce the belief that it was imported from the mother country. At a certain point in the road, there is a cluster of German picnic gardens. I will stop to explain this. There was a place called Schutzen Park, which occupied almost 2 blocks from 49th to 53rd between 3rd and 4th. It was opened around 1874. It was a spacious park area with orchards, swings, and a big dancing pavilion. It was rented by church societies and social organizations, but by 1896, it was cut up into housing lots, quote, when the growth of the borough did away with the possibilities of picnicking at the old park, the last to go in South Brooklyn. The owner made a fortune on the real estate. About 10 blocks away, between 60 and 61st, 3rd and 4th, there was also another one called Bayview Park. Although Bayview Park was an ideal place for picnics, it lacked the charm and magnetism of Schuetzen Park. Bayview closed in 1899 when a reporter saw a for sale sign and wrote that it resembled, quote, a deserted country seat. And there were even other old picnic parks. There was Pope's on 36th and 5th. There was Manhattan on 59th and 3rd, but they were already closed by the time that this was written. For the honest Teuton has particular satisfaction in swallowing great draughts of shink beer in the open air, and this is greatly increased when he has before him a fine view. No philosopher of the 19th century has worked out satisfactorily the problem presented by picnic gardens, tracing the subtle connection between the prospect of the distant water with its shining gleams like molten silver and its gliding sails and multitudinous steamers and the consumption of bologna sausage and Swiss cheese. But it is a demonstrated fact that when the day is fine and everything in the distant landscape stands out clearly and distinctly, the sandwiches and schinken disappear with great promptitude and cheerfulness. But should the weather be misty, should an envious veil of haze hide the crests of Staten Island and the distant horizon of the New Jersey hills, then the appetite of the picnickers is as bounded as the view, and the attendants of the place gaze with sadness upon the undiminishing heap of these delicious dainties, which are comprehended under the generic name of Wurst. A few hundred yards beyond the last of these is the depot of one of the many railways that communicate with Brooklyn's sea beaches and Brooklyn's race courses. Here, if he is wise, the walker will desert 3rd Avenue and walk along 2nd Avenue, which is now called Ridge Boulevard, which is a broad and fine thoroughfare lined on one side with magnificent grounds and gardens belonging to villas not always visible from the road. These all have something worthy of an observant eye. In one instance, it is a group of paulownias of great size and much symmetry. In another, it is a hedge of Osage orange trees of the most luxuriant growth. And one cannot help wondering how a plant that belongs emphatically to warm countries should have prospered so greatly here. Then, in a third place, there is a sassafras tree of unusual size. Seldom is it higher than 40 feet, but this one seems to be 60 at the very least. In another garden, there are groups of grand old oaks of the large-leaved variety. In another, pear trees whose branches bend down with a load of fruit. In another, there are splendid evergreens and scores of robins and brown thrushes. The pedestrian should turn once again to the west when he gets to the end of 2nd Avenue. This is about 92nd Street, I think. And he will have on both sides of him market gardens where men and women are picking tomatoes and filling great wagons with the deep red cloves. This path will bring him to a narrow road that follows the windings of the shore along the bay. This is shore road. And goes up and down and in and out in a perfectly natural and pleasing manner, much more delightful, however, to the pedestrian than to the driver of a buggy. This is a charming locality and offers continually fresh objects of interest on either side. The footpath skirts the banks, which sometimes rises to the dignity of a cliff, and indeed is infinitely more cliff-like than the walk along the beach at Long Branch. For this is not only very much higher at various points, but at others has rocky boulders and serried clumps of cedars, many of them belonging to the remote past, when this part of land was left in its natural condition. Mixed up with the cedars are other trees that were planted subsequently, and among these are here and there a Lombardy poplar. But generally there are splendid beeches of the European variety, and there are acacias and elms, and even a hop tree of the hornbeam family, which must have been brought from Virginia. The wild grapevines and Virginia creepers have grown in the most luxuriant way, massing themselves around the decaying trunks of dead trees and flinging their sprays like natural bridges across to other supports. The leaves of the creepers are now beginning to reflect the glowing hue of time's inverted torch, and the blossoms of the fall, the goldenrods, and the blue cornflowers mingle exquisitely with the reddened foliage. These banks and cliffs are for the most part the property of owners of the handsome villas on the other side of the road, and trespassing is deprecated by a multiplicity of signs, which are not always respected. For just as the Teuton loves his beer and his lunch in spots whence he can contemplate the glories of the bay, so the tramp, who has been charitably supplied with bread and meat, has apparently huge satisfaction in disposing of the same, and of the half-dozen ripe tomatoes that have casually wandered into his pockets, in the most comfortable and most convenient spots along the sides of the cliff, in utter defiance of printed suggestions to dogs and man-tramps. Come when you will along the Fort Hamilton Road, Shore Road, and you will always see a tramp or two either reclining under the shade of a wide-spreading beech tree surveying the glad waters of the Narrows, or else with his back against a tall cedar, taking huge bites out of a colossal sandwich. It is a surprising fact that with so much water around, the tramp has never been discovered in the act of bathing by any inhabitant of the Fort Hamilton villas. The pedestrian will do well to return by the village and the 3rd Avenue Road, as he will see many noble specimens of fine trees. In the village, there is a queer cottage that is the Italian summer house style and looks for all the world as if it was all parlors. But it is larger than it seems and has a basement. It stands in a small garden that combines a glorious old sycamore of great size, a fine silver poplar with a clear trunk, and a wide-spreading canopy of upper branches, and some exceedingly old apple trees whose fruit is not specially inviting to the eye. By walking down 92nd Street, the wanderer finds himself once more on 3rd Avenue, and if he resists the appealing gesture of the conductors on the dummy line cars, who seem surprised that anyone should walk who is master of a nickel, he will not repent it. For he will travel for the most part under the shade of noble maple trees and will see some splendid masses of salvias in the grounds of the inebriate asylum, which is the Visitation Monastery now. And at one point where the level of 3rd Avenue is very high, he will have an exceptionally fine sight of a splendid prospect to the south. Small as is the distance between this road and the one that winds along the shore, it is yet sufficient to give enchantment to the view. There is an added softness to the verdure of Staten Island, and there is more tender purple to the far-off mountains of New Jersey, and the water of the bay is more silvery, more bright. One can see plainly from this point what... One can see plainly from this point what the effect of the Bartholdi Statue is to be, and it must be owned that it is disappointing. Even should it be all that its friends have hoped for it, and should it not be all that its critics have declared it will be. It is unfortunate in its site, being absolutely dwarfed by its surroundings. At present, though nearly completed, it makes no more effect in the landscape than the spire of St. John's Church on Staten Island, which rises gracefully from the water's edge not far from Fort Wadsworth, but of course does not seem very large, having behind it the highest point of the ridge of hills forming the backbone of Staten Island. It is dubious if it is even as effective as the spire of St. John's, for there are points of view whence you can get the effect against the blue sky, and then its mass has some importance. But the statue will not unite with its pedestal as the spire with the church, but persists in forming two masses, one dark, one light. This detracts greatly from the appearance as a whole and makes it less large in appearance than a big sailing vessel. It is no doubt colossal in its dimension, but its surroundings dwarf it. And that's how he ends the column. Does anybody have their own criticisms of the Bartholdi Statue?
It took the Italian Americans a long time to get this rich name. And when JFK got assassinated, they wanted to name everything that. So we had to do. What would E.R.G. think about the Giovanni di Verrazzano Bridge today?
Well, his problem with Italians was that he worried that they wouldn't assimilate to American culture and American values, and that therefore they posed a threat. But I think that generations and generations later, we've seen that Italians have, of course, become Americans and fit in with the culture here. So I think had he lived to see that, he wouldn't have been upset about naming a bridge after an Italian, because he would have been proven wrong in his fears about what Italians were maybe capable of doing to this country.
E.R.G. was a defender of the Brooklyn Bridge, right?
I don't know that he ever expresses an opinion about the bridge. They're afraid that with the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge, all of the people who live in Brooklyn are going to stop shopping in Brooklyn and they're going to start shopping in Manhattan. But I think it turns out like the opposite becomes true, that people from Manhattan start shopping in Brooklyn and the Brooklyn people stay put in Brooklyn. But it was a similar thing on Fulton Street in the 70s when they were afraid that people were going to drive to Long Island to go to the mall. And so they kind of... And then there's Amazon, which has destroyed all the commercial streets.
Sure. On that point about the Brooklyn Bridge, and you mentioned that he was sort of anti-development, but in the context of the booming of Brooklyn, were there any like commercial interest in his column? Meaning, like, ironically, did his column sort of advance, development and speculation through these parts of Brooklyn? And then the follow-up is, was his column syndicated, or was he exclusive to the Eagle?
No, it was exclusive to the Eagle. I wouldn't say necessarily that he was anti-development. I just think that he appreciated that there were parts of Kings County that were still kind of rural or wild, and he appreciated the difference between like city and country. And what effect his columns had is hard to say, but if they were as popular as the sort of suggests inside, I would see him kind of promoting the development, or at least the exploration of these places by, people coming over from Manhattan on the bridge, could walk around Brooklyn and see all the things that he was talking about, kind of inspire people to be in Brooklyn. I think there's a quote in the introduction there's a book from the 1970s called The Eagle and Brooklyn that's a pretty comprehensive history of Brooklyn Eagle. And so I quote in there, "This book has stressed the importance of a community's need for a clear image of itself and the importance of people's feelings about their surroundings. The Eagle understood to an extraordinary degree that its readers had to relate in a familiar way to neighborhoods, to dead heroes, and to sturdy old buildings. It knew that some kind of face-to-face relationship and some kind of public acknowledgement for otherwise forgotten men, women, and children was imperative for humans living in a rapidly changing urban milieu." And that's kind of this book to a T, that kind of Brooklyn boosterism that the Eagle was so full of, not just in these columns, but that's kind of what it was about. Was Brooklyn's a great place. Like, let's remember our history. Let's look at our physical landscape. Let's, all share in this wonderful place, even if you were moving here from New York.
So to annotate something so thoroughly, such a labor of love, was there anything that you found that was a slam dunk or that was really satisfying to track down and like kept you going in all the research?
So much. No, it's really, it's the amount of annotations is really something. There's at least like 30 a chapter, so we're talking, 600 to 1,000 footnotes in this book. And a lot of it was just kind of throwaway, like he mentioned something and it's like, all right, I gotta like figure out what this is, But it's like, I don't need to spend a page talking about what it is, I just need like a few sentences, but I have to do all this research and then condense it all down to just a few sentences so that somebody reading this can be like, oh, okay. But yeah, there are just kind of countless examples. There was a YMCA revival tent near Grand Army Plaza that he mentions in passing, and it's like, now I gotta dig and figure this out. Cleveland Place that I mentioned before. There's the Fifth Avenue Casino in Park Slope. There's the Brooklyn Institute. There's the Graham Institute for Old Ladies. There's
All of these places sound magical.
Yeah, so there's just like kind of countless. There, he mentions the Brooklyn Museum at one point, but the Brooklyn Museum, as we know it, didn't exist yet. And it turns out the Brooklyn Museum was a sort of vaudeville theater on Flatbush Avenue where you could put like a nickel in a machine and the machine would like make a pin, and then you could like take the pin home as a souvenir. So kind of all of these like you've never heard of this place before because it wasn't really a big deal. But when you start digging through the newspaper archives, they wrote about it, like this new place opened and he mentions it. And so you can sort of piece together all this stuff that otherwise, why would you be thinking about? So to answer your question, the whole book is a slam dunk.
As far as you know, or have any other historians or writers taken any significant notice of E.R.G, or you
I think I'm the first. As I was saying before, like he's been quoted. You're seeing this growing trend among historians, at least in New York, where they are using newspapers.com, which is this place that has searchable scans of hundreds of thousands of newspapers around the country and around the world. But significantly, I think there are like 6 Brooklyn papers and several more New York papers. And so people are starting to do more research through the newspaper record. And that's why when I was writing about Shore Road, and when Joseph Alexiou was writing about Gowanus, and when Robert Furman was writing about Brooklyn Heights, they all cite E.R.G. because they found a column pertinent to their own hyperlocal focus. But as far as I know, I'm the only person who ever realized that E.R.G. wrote a lot of columns and that they were good, and maybe we should look at them in their entirety, something to not look at as just little bits and pieces, but as an oeuvre worthy of its own study.
Did anyone else come to the same conclusion as you was?
I don't think nobody ever thought about it. No one ever tried or cared. Yeah.
I think we should have a contest to see who can figure out who E.R.G. is.
Sure. I mean, if anybody could come up with, compelling evidence that it is not Edward Rowland Green and that they, in fact, have a much better candidate, I will give them
A book.
$25 or more. You could negotiate. You might get me up to 100, but that better be some pretty compelling evidence. Yeah.
When you're doing a book like this, what is the process, or do you need to worry about getting the rights to publish the old columns?
It's public domain, right? I think there's I forget exactly the cutoff, but the cutoff point for public domain is somewhere in the 1920s right now, which is why, why Steamboat Willie just became, and these are long before Steamboat Willie. So I didn't check, I didn't ask, I just very arrogantly assumed that I could publish this. And if I turn out to be wrong, then I can't give somebody the $100 for finding out who E.R.G.
You have a family, so you say.
Right, that's the other thing, is that Edward Rowland Green, I mean, he may have had like a niece. I seem to recall something like he hosted a wedding celebration at his home or something. But to my knowledge, there are, maybe I need to track down that family line. Was your great uncle a newspaper columnist? Yes, he always talked about it. For 6 magical months in his 20s, he wrote these columns in the Eagle, and he always would regale us with tales.
He was a depressed lawyer the rest of his life.
Right.
Did Bliss Park, or what we now know as Owl's Head Park, was it?
No, that would have still been the Bliss Estate at this point.
Does he describe it?
No, because he gets off 3rd Avenue somewhere just over, the city line was at 60th Street. That's when Brooklyn became New Utrecht at that part. But he doesn't go down first. Like he gets off at 3rd, but he goes to 2nd Avenue or Ridge Boulevard, and he follows that for a really long time. And then he goes down to Shore Road, so he kind of skips over the Bliss Estate.
When can I purchase this book?
You can. It's only available at select libraries for reference works. No, yes, I have many copies of this book for sale. The list price is $19. I am selling them for $15. I will sign them. I also have a handful of copies of many of my other books, including, as Dan told you before, True Crime Bay Ridge, which will be $10. More True Crime Bay Ridge, and How Bay Ridge Became Bay Ridge, all of which, let's put them at $15. So everything $15 except True Crime Bay Ridge a little cheaper. And I also have a single copy of the least popular book that I've ever published, which is called Old Sleuth the Detective, or The Bay Ridge Mystery. I did not write this. It is a 19th century dime novel that I transcribed and republished because it has long been out of print. It's silly. It's fun. I would give it about 3 stars out of 5. But sure, 3.5. But nobody likes it and nobody buys it. And every time I email the bookmark shop and I'm like, hey, do you need more books? And they're like, oh yeah, like we'll take a few of everything. And I'm like, even Old Sleuth the Detective? And they're like, no. So I brought one because I thought maybe I could kind of, intrigue people with this sad commentary. But are there any other questions, comments, concerns? Yes, you in the back.
I noticed that most, if not all of your books have these really beautiful covers. I just want to know, the guy that's the cover.
Yeah, so I taught myself Photoshop, and then all of the book covers, including the best one, which coincidentally is Old Sleuth, were designed by that man in the back, Michael Verderami, who professionally goes by the name Silent Salesman. And if you need any book covers or deli signage or anything in between, that's your guy right there. Right there, that's your guy.
Which is the best book to read alone in a cabin in the woods?
True crime. True crime. Definitely the true crime.
Yeah, I think people are probably right. It would be the true crime. I think more true crime Bay Ridge is better than true crime Bay Ridge, but they both kind of just go together. So if you wanted to read one and not the other, you should probably buy both. But it also depends how you're feeling in this cabin. Like, are you feeling homesick for Brooklyn? Because then the streets of Brooklyn would, enable you to sort of, experience a little taste of home. Same with how Bay Ridge became Bay Ridge. But if you're just looking for like a beach read, vacation read kind of thing, the true crime ones are definitely.
When might you want to read the Snoop one?
What's it?
When would you want to read the Snoop one?
Oh, I don't know because no one wants to read it. It doesn't
Let
sell.
us know when you read it.
It doesn't sell well in the summer. It doesn't sell well in the fall. It doesn't in the winter. It's not a good Christmas gift. It's not. I don't know. I think it's cool and I think it's fun. I'm just letting you know that no one agrees with you. Yeah, there are about probably 25, 30 copies in print. One day to be probably as valuable as the original itself. Just as rare, just from a different time period.
Did you say that E.R.G. or your leading candidate for E.R.G. is buried in Greenville?
Yes. There's a family plot. It's his parents, his half-brother, I think a brother that died like in childhood or infancy, maybe a handful of other people, but it's right by, you can see like, what is it, 36th Street, the sort of southern border. You can see like 36th and 9th Avenue from where it is. I've been there twice. Once to apologize if he wasn't really E.R.G. Sorry, I've told everyone this is what you did. Sorry if you didn't.
Can you see the Bartholdi statue from there?
No, you cannot. Actually, one of the arguments against the Edward Rowland Green theory, I don't know if I can find it here, but you'd be surprised to know E.R.G. has very strong opinions about what makes the best stone for headstones. And he insults
Italians?
Again.
right, marble. He's like marble's no good. Right, he insults granite as a stone for a headstone, and Edward Rowland Green's grave appears to be granite. So
had a change of heart later.
Yes, he could have. I mean, many years passed in between.
Yeah, we all have wrong-headed opinions at 25.
Especially about granite.
It's
And the Bartholdi Statue.
Cyanite is much more suitable for a cemetery than either white marble or granite, but the real thing is red porphyry. Yeah, it's also possible that, he did not arrange for his own headstone, and as a final insult to him,
He's turning his grave.
his half brother was like, we'll do granite.
And the Italians of the grave.
Right.
Do you think his referral to the island of Manhattan as being shaped like a bottle of olive oil was a slight against Italians?
Very possibly, yes. Because, he does not like New York. And,
Yes, or Italian.
and he does not like Italians. His thoughts about olive oil, I don't think comes up again.
What appears to be his favorite neighborhood or street?
He seems most attached to Brooklyn Heights in general. And I think Clinton Street and Henry Street are his favorite streets.
Oh, Henry Street.
Yes, a man after my own heart. Modern historians seem to believe that Henry Street was named after Thomas Henry, who was a physician to the Mittig family. But he posits in this book that Henry Street is actually named after Hezekiah Pierrepont's son, Henry Evelyn Pierrepont, who was a leading citizen of Brooklyn in his day. He founded or co-founded like Greenwood Cemetery, the Brooklyn Historical Society, like the Brooklyn Orphanage, the Brooklyn Hospital. He was just like, his whole life was about improving Brooklyn. And that seems to me more plausible, that Old Man Pierrepont would have named that street after his son rather than the Mittig's doctor. But there's a couple of like just, he has a theory on the origin of the name Gowanus that seems to me the most plausible that I've ever read, which is that two men who bought, they were the first settlers in Brooklyn, and they had this huge piece of land from like the waterfront eastward and from like 20-something to like 60th Street. And one of them, he posits, was Scots origin, and that there's a Scots dialect word for daisies, which is Gowans. And he thinks that in the that the Scots had a tradition of naming their land things. They always had a name for their land, and that because of all of the daisies in this piece of land, that he called it Gowans, and that when he went to Albany to a Dutch speaker and said it's called Gowans, they wrote it Gouwanes, and that looking back on it, when we look at that, we're like, oh, Gowanus, which is supposed to be like a Native American chief, except there are no records of a Native American chief named Gowanus. So it actually seems to me, it's a sort of thing that's unknowable, like we'll never know why it's called Gowanus, but the idea that it would be named Gowans seems the most plausible theory I've heard. So some of his
Etymology?
Etymological theories are good. They're smart. And other times they're really bad. So let's call it. Thanks everybody for coming out. Sign books and then get out of here.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening, and thanks so much to Henry and Barrow's Intense Ginger for hosting us. If you want to grab a copy of any of Henry's books, check them out on Amazon, or, better yet, check out the bookmark shop. That's it for us today, but we will be back very soon with brand new episodes and analyses. We are already updating the webpage with all kinds of events that are going on this summer, so summer strolls, concerts. Check it out on the webpage at www.radiofreebayridge.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, if you can stand it at this point, Instagram, and of course, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, everyone, stay free, Bay Ridge.